You didn't press play by mistake. Maybe this is where grace was waiting to meet you again. And now it begins to whisper. You sit in the quiet, not because you were looking for silence, but because it found you. Maybe it's late. Maybe it's early. Maybe it's one of those in-between hours when the world is blurry and your soul feels like it's somewhere just outside your body. Outside, the city hums faintly, cars, refrigerators, Wi-Fi signals buzzing like invisible insects. But here in this moment, it's just you and something else. Something you used to call God. Someone you haven't spoken to in a while. You shift slightly under the weight of your thoughts. Not heavy, not loud, just full. You've been feeling this strange ache lately, like a homesickness for a place you don't remember leaving. A subtle, steady pull under your ribs. It arrives when things go quiet, when the dopamine drops, when no one's texting back, when the AI stops replying, when you finally stop refreshing the feed. You're not even sure what you're hoping to hear anymore. Was it you who walked away? Or has God been silent all this time? There's this image. You can't shake a child sitting on a curb, feet dangling, watching the driveway for someone who hasn't come home in years. That child is part of you. The part that used to believe without needing proof. The part that used to speak without rehearsing the words. But life got loud, and faith got tired. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still with me, comment below where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I'd love to know who's out there in the quiet with me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie back, not in surrender, but something close. You begin to let go of the clenching. You've asked before, why don't I feel God anymore? But maybe the question beneath it is harder. What if He doesn't feel me? It's easier to assume we've been forgotten than to admit we've grown too busy to listen. Because listening isn't passive. It's the courage to be still. And stillness, that's a language we're not fluent in anymore. You used to feel Him in music, in quiet tears, in moments when the sky turned a specific shade of dusk and your chest filled with something too big to name. Now, you mostly feel your phone buzzing, your to-do list pressing, the algorithm guessing what you'll want next. And yet, none of it touches that hollow place. Sometimes in your scrolling, a reel pauses just long enough to feel holy. A baby laughing, a stranger helping another, a video with soft music and slow words whispering something about worth. You don't cry, but your throat tightens. It's not the content, it's the reminder that maybe you're still reachable. There's a parable that used to mean something to you, about a shepherd who leaves 99 sheep just to find the one that wandered off. When you were younger, you thought that was a sweet story. Now, you wonder if it's even possible. Who leaves everything for one lost thing anymore? The world doesn't. It's busy, optimizing, upgrading. But maybe God isn't like the world. Maybe God never optimized. Maybe He still waits. You think about the last time you prayed. Not the emergency prayers, not the automatic grace before meals. The real kind, the whisper in the dark kind. You can't quite remember the words, just the feeling. Like speaking into a cave and hoping for an echo. Like a message in a bottle tossed out to sea. And even now, as you lie here listening, you're still unsure if you're trying to reach God or if you're hoping He's trying to reach you. Do you know what abandonment feels like? It feels like silence that used to be filled with something. It feels like a room that still remembers the warmth of a goodbye. It feels like you. But here's the unbearable truth. What if he didn't leave? What if he's been here watching you scroll, waiting as you slept through sermons, listening through the noise you thought kept you safe? And now that you're finally quiet again, he leans in. Not to lecture, not to scold, but to simply sit with you. To remind you that love doesn't always speak, it sometimes waits. Maybe you needed to be lonely enough to feel accompanied. Maybe your ache is just love stretched across time and silence. Maybe God misses you too. You think about the people you've drifted from, how it happened without drama, without anger, just days turning into weeks, and then space. You didn't mean to stop talking. Life just happened. And maybe that's how it happened with God. But absence doesn't equal abandonment. Not in heaven, not in hearts. There's a whisper now, soft but sure. Not in your ears, but in your chest. Like a door you didn't realize you could open from the inside. And if you crack it open even a little, you'll see that no one moved. He's been here the whole time. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight. Not fix anything, not perform, just rest. And as your breath slows, as your thoughts grow fuzzier, you feel it. A presence that doesn't demand, a love that doesn't need noise, a God who is still here even in the silence, even now. You wake though you never quite fell asleep. The edges of your thoughts still hum faintly like the screen left on in another room. You stare at the ceiling, or maybe just into the space behind your eyes, and something lingers there. A question you didn't mean to ask out loud. Has God gone quiet? Or did your soul just forget his voice? You reach for your phone. Habit, not hunger. You scroll without aim, just to feel movement. Your thumb becomes a metronome, keeping time against the ache. Swipe, swipe, swipe. Each flick another heartbeat, asking for meaning in an ocean of meaningless motion. The algorithm knows what you watched last night. It remembers how long you lingered on that soft-voiced video, how many seconds your attention held. It tries again, offering comfort disguised as content. A whispered meditation, a slow walk in the woods, a virtual hug from someone you'll never meet. You pause. For a second, it almost works. Then the feed shifts. The screen fills with polished people saying all the right things in all the wrong ways. Spirituality turned into performance. Faith turned into brand. God turned into content. You feel both too much and not enough. You close the app. Your soul doesn't want noise tonight. There's this weird parallel you can't unsee now between the algorithm and prayer. Both invisible, both designed to respond, but only one asks nothing in return. You start wondering, what if God has an algorithm too? What if every time you turned your face to the window, or sighed after a long day, or said please to no one in particular, that was a data point in heaven? What if every aching thought you never formed into a sentence still reached him? Maybe grace doesn't need you to phrase it right. You remember being a child, holding up broken toys or skinned knees, saying nothing but knowing someone would come. You didn't need eloquence. You needed presence. Maybe prayer isn't a paragraph, it's a posture. And maybe even now, you're still being heard. You look around your room. The glow from a screen left on. The faint buzz of the charger. A glass with a fingerprint. Your world is full of echoes, each one a small reminder you're not invisible even if you feel unseen. You breathe out slower this time, not to empty, but to make space. There's a story Jesus told once about a man who knocked on his neighbor's door in the middle of the night, not for himself, but to ask for bread to feed a guest. The neighbor didn't want to get up, but the man kept knocking, not out of rudeness, but hope. You think about how often you've stopped knocking, not because you stopped needing, but because you stopped believing there was anyone behind the door. What if knocking was the point? What if persistence wasn't about wearing God down, but about reminding your own heart that it still longs for something? Your heart has grown quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. Numbness wears the same costume as peace, but they are not the same. Numbness is the quiet that comes from too much noise. Peace is the quiet that arrives when the noise surrenders. You realize you've settled for the first, while your soul aches for the second. You glance at your phone again, but this time you don't pick it up. What if God doesn't compete with the algorithm? What if he whispers because he refuses to shout over your distractions? What if he doesn't flood your feed with answers because he's more interested in your presence than your performance? Maybe you've spent so much time broadcasting your curated self that you forgot how to be your honest self. Not the filtered version. The version who still wonders if love lasts. If grace really applies to you. If God even remembers your name. And maybe that's the version he misses most. You think about how many times you've talked about God, but not to him. It's easier to analyze than to surrender. Easier to theorize than to trust. Easier to scroll past truth than to sit with it. But the ache doesn't go away. It only buries itself deeper. And tonight it rises again. You feel it in your chest, like a pulse beneath the pain. Like a whisper beneath the noise. Like God typing 3 dots, waiting for you to stop refreshing. You wonder what he would say if he could DM you. Not a sermon, not a quote. Maybe just, I never left. Or I miss you too. And you realize it would wreck you. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's true. You lie back again. You let the thought stay. What if every time you were ghosted, forgotten, overlooked, God kept noticing? What if he's been following you not with judgment, but with longing? Noticing the jokes you fake laughed at, the birthday you quietly spent alone, the question you didn't ask because you were afraid the silence would answer first. He noticed, not to log it, but to hold it. He never asked you to prove anything. He only asked you to be still long enough to feel held. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight. Let your heart unscroll. Let your soul recharge. Let the silence become sacred again, because even now, especially now, God is here. Listening not for your perfect words, but for your honest breath. And maybe, just maybe, this quiet is not the absence of God. Maybe it's the place where he finally gets to speak. The ceiling hasn't changed, but you see it differently now. Not with your eyes, those are tired, but with something behind them, a part of you that's still waking up, still stretching into awareness like a limb fallen asleep. It tingles, not with pain, but with memory. You remember when you used to think God was everywhere, in the wind, in the way a dog looked up at you, in the warmth of sunlight on the floor. You didn't question it, you just noticed it. You called it normal. Holy was something ordinary once. Now, everything is connected through wires. You sync your thoughts to calendars, your relationships to apps, your emotions to status bars. You are seen by everyone and understood by no one. You are more reachable than ever and more hidden than you've ever been. You wonder if God fits into the cloud, not the one in the sky, the one that holds your photos, your thoughts, your auto-filled prayers. You store your life in megabytes now, moments compressed into folders. Even grief gets archived. If God is omnipresent, is He in your devices too? You imagine Him scrolling through your memories, not with critique, but with care. A kind of reverent curiosity, like someone flipping through a scrapbook of a child who stopped visiting. He lingers on one photo. Your smile looks real in that one. Then He closes the album. Not because He's done, but because He doesn't need it to remember you. You are not data to Him. You are dust and breath and spirit. You are more than what you've uploaded, more than what you've lost. You think of the cross now, not as punishment, but as presence. Not as justice, but as proximity. A symbol of a God who refused to stay distant even when it hurt. A God who didn't send instructions from the sky, but who stepped into the mess wearing skin. You wonder what that kind of God does with your silence. Maybe He doesn't fix it. Maybe He fills it. There's something deeply disarming about the idea that you don't have to perform for God, that you don't have to pose or brand or optimize your presence, that He isn't asking for a version of you. He's asking for you, the real you, the tired one, the unsure one, the one whose attention span has been frayed by 1,000 notifications, the one who sometimes wonders if they're even capable of stillness anymore. And in this unraveling, you catch a glimpse of something that feels like freedom. It comes not as a sermon or a post. It comes as a question. What if your worth never depended on your signal strength? You've been told to stay connected, but connected to what your battery is full. Your soul is empty. You stare at your screensaver, a swirling infinite pattern. It's beautiful, but it goes nowhere. That's what this week has felt like. That's what most weeks have felt like. You try to think of the last time you felt awe, not content, not comfort, awe. The kind that humbles you, that makes your problems feel small, not because they don't matter, but because something bigger is holding them. Maybe God was in that moment. Maybe you didn't name Him. Maybe you didn't even recognize Him. But maybe He was there anyway. There's this line in your mind, not a quote, but a knowing. Presence doesn't require acknowledgement to be real. You exhale, slow, controlled, letting that truth wrap itself around your thoughts like a blanket fresh from the dryer. Perhaps you don't need to rediscover God. Perhaps you just need to remember that He never left. There's a parable about a father watching the road, waiting for the return of a child who wandered far. The child had a speech prepared, apologies and deals and explanations. But the father didn't need any of it. He ran. He embraced. He celebrated. You think about your own returns, how awkward it can feel to come back to something you left. The shame, the uncertainty, the fear of being unwanted. But God isn't holding a clipboard. He's not tallying absences. He's running. You haven't drifted too far. You've just drifted long. And tonight might be the soft return. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you don't ask for anything. You don't try to feel anything. You just are. And maybe that's where it starts. Maybe that's where God meets you. Not when you rise to the occasion, but when you sink into surrender. You're tired of earning everything. You want to be held. You want grace that doesn't keep score. Love that doesn't refresh every 24 hours. Hope that doesn't expire when your motivation does. And maybe that's exactly what God has always offered. Not a transaction, a homecoming. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, not to arrive with answers, not to prove you're worthy, just to be the one He was waiting to walk home with. You don't need to update your status. You don't need to tag Him. You don't need to broadcast your journey. God knows your location. And tonight, He draws closer, not through noise, not through fireworks, but through the softest whisper that sounds a lot like peace. The stillness starts to feel less foreign now. Not comfortable, not yet, but less like a stranger sitting beside you in the dark. You're not entirely sure what shifted. Maybe it's not a shift at all. Maybe it's a remembering. You catch yourself listening, not to sound, but to space. The way your breathing fills it, the way your heartbeat suddenly feels louder, that quiet thump behind your ribs that rise and fall of your chest, evidence that something is still here, something is still alive, even if it's weary. You've spent so much of your life trying to be seen. Not in the narcissistic sense, just understood, heard. You learned how to present, how to polish. You became fluent in performance. You knew when to smile, how to nod, what version of yourself was acceptable in which room. But now, there's no audience, no camera, no filter, just you, and maybe God. Though you still aren't sure if you should say His name out loud. It feels too sacred, too close to something you lost, or left, or were left by. You roll the name around in your mind anyway. Not like a prayer, more like a memory. God, does He still feel close to that name, or has it been warped by all the people who claim to speak for Him? You flinch a little at that thought. It's true, though. Somewhere along the way, faith became noisy. Loud voices, harsh lines, so many rules and declarations, but very little room for questions, very little softness. You needed softness, and maybe that's why you stopped listening. Because the God they described didn't sound like the one you used to talk to at night. The one who knew when you were scared. The one who understood when all you could do was cry into your pillow and say nothing at all. You wonder if He still understands. If silence on your end was ever interpreted as distance, or worse, rejection. But maybe invisibility isn't absence. Maybe it's intimacy without performance. Maybe He was never looking for your words. Maybe He just missed your presence. You think about how many friendships faded, not with fights, just distance. The way people stopped texting, stopped checking in, not out of malice, out of fatigue, out of life. And you wonder if your relationship with God faded the same way. You didn't mean to let it go. But things got loud and complicated, and you had questions you weren't sure He'd want to answer. So you stopped showing up, and yet somehow He stayed. There's an image you can't shake, a hand held out in the dark, not reaching for you, but simply waiting. No pressure, no threat, just the quiet offer of companionship. It's not dramatic, it's not even visible, but something in you wants to reach back. Maybe faith doesn't always roar. Maybe it sometimes whispers. And maybe tonight the whisper is enough. You think of the way Jesus described the kingdom of heaven like a mustard seed. Tiny, overlooked, but powerful. It doesn't explode into being. It grows almost invisibly. Maybe that's what's happening in you. Not a revival, just growth. Tiny, hesitant, sacred. You breathe again. A little deeper this time. A little slower. You remember sitting in churches as a child, staring at stained glass and wondering if those colors meant anything. You didn't understand the stories, but you liked how the light looked when it passed through them. Maybe that was God too. Not the meaning, just the light. Now all these years later, you realize something. You've never stopped craving light. You just started settling for glow. Screens glow, but souls crave something more. Something warm, something true. You think of all the things you've chased that promise to make you feel better, more productive, more worthy, more wanted. And now you sit here in the dark with all of it behind you. And strangely, you don't feel failure. You feel invitation. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to let yourself be held without fixing, to let your questions stay open without guilt, to believe just for a moment that maybe God still wants you, even unfinished. You lie back again and you don't try to pray. You just exhale. And if your exhale sounds like a yes, then maybe that's all heaven was waiting for. You're not sure when it started, the sense that your life had become something God no longer watched. Not because he turned away, but because maybe you became too boring to observe, too repetitive, too wrapped in the mundane of scrolling and surviving. And yet tonight, something begins to rise. A thought you didn't plant. A question that doesn't accuse, only wonders. What if God misses your presence the same way you miss his? You imagine what his version of a feed would look like. Not the curated highlight reel you show the world. Not the cleaned up version you post. But the real one. The unsent messages. The hesitation before pressing send. The way your hand trembles when you're lonely, but you pretend to laugh on call anyway. Would God scroll past that? Or would he pause? Would he see the silence between your words and know you're exhausted not just physically, but soul deep? The kind of exhaustion that no nap can cure. The kind that comes from pretending too long, from performing without applause. You wonder if God keeps notifications for your absence, not in guilt, but in longing. You picture him checking in the way you check on friends who've gone quiet, the way your heart skips when someone hasn't been online, the way you whisper, "Are you okay?" into a silence that doesn't echo back. Maybe he's whispered that over you more times than you know. Maybe every time you chose distraction over connection. He didn't pull away. He stayed, quiet, present, not offended, just waiting. You think of your own friendships, the ones you lost track of. Not because you didn't care, but because life scattered your attention across too many tabs. That's how relationships dissolve now. Not with explosions, with notifications. So maybe God didn't go anywhere. Maybe your awareness just shifted, like a browser tab left open. Still running, still alive. You want to believe that he still checks in, that he still notices, not because you're important on paper, not because you've done anything remarkable, but because you are his, because nothing about you was ever forgettable to him. There's a parable Jesus told, one you never really understood as a kid, about a woman who loses a single coin and turns her whole house upside down looking for it. When she finds it, she throws a party. You used to wonder why anyone would celebrate something so small. Now you understand, because small things matter when they're loved. And maybe to God, you've never been small, just sacred. You begin to feel it now, not as noise, but as nearness, not as a miracle, just a movement, a presence that doesn't demand recognition, but quietly fills the room you thought was empty. You close your eyes and feel the weight of your body in the bed. Not spiritual, just real. And maybe that's the point. Maybe holiness isn't found in lofty ideas, but in this, a tired human lying still. A heart whispering, I'm here. A God whispering back, I know. You wonder how many times you thought no one saw you. That night, you sat in the bathroom just to cry alone. That moment, you canceled plans, not because you were busy, but because your soul was brittle. That afternoon, you smiled in public while your inner world fell apart. You hid well, but not from him, and not because he invaded your privacy, but because he chose to dwell there, in the cracks, in the unraveling, in the questions. You ask yourself, if God feels your absence, what would it take to feel his nearness again? Maybe not a pilgrimage, not a confession, maybe not even a prayer, maybe just a moment, like this one, where you admit that you miss being known. You miss being still. You miss believing that someone somewhere knows your soul without needing you to explain it. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight. You don't need to initiate a conversation. You don't need to find the perfect words. You just need to stay here, breathing, listening, receiving. Maybe that's what faith is, now not certainty, but stillness. Not knowledge, but nearness. And maybe even now, God refreshes his feed and smiles, because you're here. And that was all he ever wanted. You let your eyes drift, not because you're tired, but because looking inward finally feels safer than looking out. The world outside is sharp, bright, loud. It demands you to be on. But here in this quiet corner of the night, there's no performance, no pressure, just you soft and undone. You start to wonder why the quiet scares you sometimes. Maybe it's because in the silence, the ache becomes audible. The questions show up uninvited. The truth comes not in a roar, but in a whisper. You don't feel close to God anymore, and that hurts more than you let on. You glance at the ceiling again, still there, still unchanging, just like your heart used to be. There's something about this ache that feels honest, not dramatic, not even spiritual, just real. Like when you lose touch with a friend you swore you'd always talk to. You didn't mean to grow apart. You just stopped calling. They stopped calling. And then, one day, the silence was so thick reaching out felt impossible. You wonder if that's what happened with God. But tonight, that thought lands differently. Not as guilt, not as failure, but as grief. Because somewhere inside you know this isn't how you wanted it to go. You wanted more presence, more connection, more him. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted more too. You imagine it now, not a God perched on a throne waiting to punish, but one sitting quietly on the edge of your life, waiting for a glance, not because he needs your attention, but because he misses your heart. You remember the way you used to speak freely, not just in prayer, but in the in-between. The pauses, the mindless moments, the late-night walks, the drives with no destination. There was always a sense of someone beside you, not watching, just there. When did that stop? Was it when you got busier? Was it when prayers started feeling pointless? Was it when technology got faster and your soul didn't keep up? You scroll through your memory, not your digital one, the real one, and suddenly something flickers. A moment. Maybe you were 12, maybe 22, but you remember sitting somewhere alone, but not lonely. And in that space, you said something out loud. It wasn't a prayer. It was a sentence, a confession, a hope. And you felt heard. You didn't see anything. No voice replied. But something settled in your chest. You forgot that moment until now. Maybe that's what grace does. It returns memories you didn't know you'd lost. Maybe tonight, it returned this one so you'd remember what it feels like to be heard. You think of all the ways you've tried to replicate that feeling. Apps, podcasts, meditations, advice from strangers with good lighting. None of it holds the same weight, because nothing artificial can replace the intimacy of being known. You're tired of outsourcing your peace. You want the real thing, even if it's quiet, even if it's slow, even if it requires waiting. There's a parable you once heard about a man who finds a treasure buried in a field. He hides it again, then sells everything just to buy that land. It always sounded odd, but tonight it doesn't, because maybe peace is like that. Maybe God is like that. A hidden treasure buried in ordinary soil, a presence beneath the noise, a love worth letting go of everything else to find. You exhale, long, not as surrender, as agreement. Something in you nods. Something in you says yes. I remember now. And just like that, you're no longer alone. Not because the room changed, but because you did. You turned inward, and there he was. Not lost, just waiting. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to come home without needing a roadmap, to remember that your soul is not behind schedule, that God didn't forget your name when you forgot how to pray. You lie still. And for the first time in a while, the silence feels like company. And in that holy hush, something settles. Not an answer, not a fix, just presence. And maybe, just maybe, that's been the miracle all along. There's a noise in the distance, barely a sound. Maybe just a car on the street, or a door creaking somewhere else in the building. But it reminds you, the world keeps spinning even when your heart stands still. Time moves, feeds update people post, and yet, here you are wrapped in this fragile quiet. You've been surrounded by sound for so long, you forgot what your own soul sounds like. Noise is the atmosphere of modern life. Even silence isn't truly silent anymore. There's always something music playing from another room. A video, auto-playing on a muted tab, the hum of a fridge, the buzz of your phone lighting up with someone else's highlight. And the strangest thing is that this noise doesn't always feel bad. Sometimes it feels like safety, like insulation, like armor. Because when it's loud, you don't have to think. And when you don't think, you don't feel. And when you don't feel, you don't ache. At least not in ways you can't control. But now, the noise is gone. And what's left behind isn't emptiness, it's you. And beneath the layers of distraction, and urgency and performance. You feel something ancient, longing, not for answers, not for applause, just for real connection. The kind that doesn't need words, the kind that listens before you even speak. You wonder if that's what prayer used to be. Not a monologue, not a request form, but a shared silence, a sacred breath. Two presences learning to sit side by side without needing to fill the gaps. You think about the loudest spaces you've entered lately. Work, news, social media, even spiritual spaces that were supposed to be peaceful, but instead became stages. There's always someone talking, always someone selling, always someone performing wisdom like a one-man show. And still, somehow, you feel lonelier in those places than you do right now. You remember a verse someone once paraphrased, "Be still and know." You never liked that verse. Stillness felt like a luxury. Who has time to be still when everything is screaming for attention? But now, you're starting to see it differently. Stillness isn't passive. Stillness is rebellion. Stillness is the refusal to let the world define what matters most. Stillness is where God waits. Not in hiding, but in gentleness. Maybe that's why we avoid it, because it's in the stillness that we're seen. And being seen, truly seen, is terrifying. What if we're not enough? What if He looks and finds us empty? What if silence confirms what shame has always whispered? But what if, just what if, God sees us and stays? What if He sees the mess and doesn't move an inch? What if instead of pulling away, He pulls closer? There's a story Jesus told about a banquet, an extravagant feast. But when the invited guests refused to come, the host sent his servant to the highways and alleyways, calling in the forgotten, the unseen, the outsiders. That story hits different tonight. You felt like an outsider to your own soul, like someone watching your life from the sidewalk. You've been the one passing by, assuming the invitation wasn't for you. But maybe it was. Maybe God has been setting the table all this time, not for the perfect version of you, for you. You try to picture it, a seat pulled out just for you. No spotlight, no performance, just presence. And a God who doesn't demand you speak, just that you stay. You begin to see the truth beneath the noise. You've always been invited. You've just been too distracted to hear the call. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight. You don't need to prove your hunger to be fed. You don't need to shout your pain to be heard. You don't need to fake stillness to earn peace. You are already at the table. The feast is already in front of you, and grace is not rationed. You close your eyes again, not to escape, but to arrive. Because even here in the quiet, you once feared God is near, and the noise it fades, because something deeper is speaking now. And it sounds like peace. You start to notice the quiet differently now. It no longer feels hollow. It doesn't echo in your chest the way it used to. There's a warmth in it, subtle, almost imperceptible, like sunlight you can't see but feel on your skin. It's not dramatic, but it's enough to stay. You think about how many corners of your life you've closed off, not just from others, but from yourself. Places where pain sat too long. Memories that grew dusty from being untouched. Moments you buried so deep, you forgot they ever hurt. You thought ignoring them was healing. You thought silence meant closure. But God doesn't only dwell in the light. He's in the quiet corners too. The ones you muted, the ones you unfollowed, The ones you told yourself didn't matter anymore. You've gotten good at curating your life. You share the parts that sparkle. You crop out the clutter. You mute the messy, and it works for a while. But there are nights like this one when the corners call out. Not loudly, not in accusation, just in that whispering voice that says you still matter here, even in this. You remember the story of Elijah on the mountain, how he expected God in the fire, in the earthquake, in the wind. But God came in a whisper, a gentle one, a sound that could be missed if you weren't paying attention. You start to think, maybe that's how God still speaks. Not where the world is loudest, but where you've gone quiet enough to hear. There's a corner in your life you haven't entered in a long time. A habit you abandoned, a dream you shelved, a conversation you never finished. Maybe it was shame, maybe fear, maybe just the chaos of life pulling your hands away before they could reach the doorknob. But tonight, you walk there again. You don't barge in, you don't clean it up, you just open the door. And to your surprise, it's not empty, it's sacred. You realize now that God wasn't waiting for you in the spotlight. He was waiting in the corner. The one you never thought he'd step into. The one you were too embarrassed to let him see. But he saw it anyway and stayed. You sit with that, not the shame, the staying. Because in a world that's always leaving, always refreshing, always chasing new God remains. And not just in holy places, in the unfollowed corners of your life. Maybe holiness isn't in what you display. Maybe it's in what you're willing to let be seen. You think about the algorithm again. How it learns from your silence just as much as your clicks. How it watches what you don't engage with. And you wonder if even machines track the ignored. How much more does God see what you've hidden, not to judge, but to redeem? You've heard it said that nothing is wasted in God's hands. You want to believe that, but belief doesn't come easy anymore. Not when you've been burned by promises. Not when the people who claim to represent God made you feel like you weren't enough. But maybe they weren't speaking for him. Maybe he's been speaking all along. In the spaces they overlooked. In the moments you discounted. In the tears you wiped away before anyone saw. There's grace in that. Not the kind that demands a comeback. The kind that makes space for your breath to return on its own. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight. To sit in the corner you once avoided. To stop curating, stop proving, stop pretending. To believe that God is still there. Not waiting for your improvement. Just waiting for your presence. You breathe again, and this time it feels like home. And in the stillness, in the softness in the space you thought was abandoned, God whispers, I never looked away. You don't reach for your phone tonight, not because you forgot it, but because you remembered something else, something quieter, something truer. A voice you haven't heard in a while, not because it stopped speaking, but because you stopped expecting it to respond. You wonder if God still hears thoughts that never make it into words. If he still reads the sentences you type in your head, but delete before they leave your mouth. You've lived in code for so long. Emoji, hearts, voice notes, half-finished captions. You sometimes forget how to speak without editing. But God doesn't need the final draft. He already saw the rough version. You lie there, thinking prayer feels complicated now. You used to close your eyes, fold your hands, and know what to say. There was a rhythm, a script. But now Now, everything feels tangled. Your mind is scattered. Your feelings come in fragments. And when you do try to speak, it's not eloquent, it's just noise. But maybe prayer isn't about clarity. Maybe it's about closeness. You think of someone who types a long message and never sends it. But somehow, the act of writing brings relief. Maybe God reads drafts too. Maybe your unsent words still matter. Maybe grace collects even the things you don't say out loud. You imagine God leaning in, not waiting for a sermon, not demanding perfection, just listening. Like someone at the edge of a playground, watching a child ramble about their day. Not every word is clear. Not every thought makes sense. But the presence is everything. You wonder how many prayers you never meant to pray, but whispered anyway. A sigh in traffic, a blink of gratitude over coffee, a thought too fragile to name, but real enough to feel. Those count, don't they? There's a story Jesus told about a man who couldn't even lift his eyes to heaven, but simply said, "Have mercy." No long speech, no clever phrasing. Just need offered honestly. You think of that man now. How small he must have felt. How unseen. And yet, he was the one who left changed. Maybe prayer is less about form and more about focus. Maybe it's not about saying the right thing, but showing up anyway. You've tried to automate everything else in your life. Meals delivered, memories stored, conversations scheduled. But prayer resists automation. It requires something you don't offer easily, any more stillness. And maybe that's the invitation tonight. Not to speak clearly, but to stay present. You begin to mumble something into the darkness. It's not profound. It's barely even a sentence. Just a word, maybe two. But you don't stop yourself this time. You let it be broken. You let it be soft. Because maybe God hears you best when you don't filter your heart. You think of all the times you've written messages to people, reread them, and deleted them out of fear. And how lonely that feels to have something to say and no safe place to say it. But what if God is the inbox that never judges, the one that doesn't need punctuation to understand you? You close your eyes again and think maybe I've been praying all along. Every hope you never admitted, every ache you never named, every moment you paused even just for breath. Maybe that was enough. Maybe he's been reading between the lines. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to know that your thoughts don't need to be polished, to trust that your silence is still sacred, to believe that the God who made stars also understands stammering. You lie still, heart open, words few, and somewhere inside the quiet, a reply comes. Not in a voice, not in a sign, but in peace. And for now, that is more than enough. You shift beneath the covers, not from discomfort, but from recognition. A memory returns soft-edged and quiet, like a light turned on in a hallway you haven't walked through in years. It's the moment you stop talking to God, not because of a crisis, not because of a betrayal, just distance. Maybe it was a slow ghosting, the kind that happens not in anger, but in exhaustion. You needed him to show up a certain way. He didn't. Or maybe he did, just not in the way you expected. And so without drama, without declaration, you simply stopped. You didn't even realize it at the time. But now looking back, you know when the conversations began to dry up, you'd whisper something half hope, half test, and hear nothing in return. No goosebumps, no miracle, just silence. the kind that stretches, the kind that makes you feel small, and slowly you gave up trying. You told yourself it didn't matter, that maybe it was childish to talk to someone you couldn't see. Maybe your prayers were naive. Maybe you were outgrowing the need to believe. But tonight, you're not so sure. Because there's a difference between growing out of something and giving up on it. And what you feel tonight isn't closure, it's longing. You remember the warmth of those old conversations. The way you used to pray like you were journaling, like talking to a friend. Not always asking for something, just narrating your day. Letting him in, letting him stay. You want that again, but shame whispers its script. You walked away. You don't get to come back like nothing happened. You chose the distance, and maybe you did. But then, love whispers louder. There's no expiration date on homecomings. You think of the prodigal son, returning rehearsed and heavy with guilt. But before the words even left his mouth, the father ran. Not walked, ran. You wonder if that's what God does when your heart even slightly turns. When your silence breaks, not with a roar, but with a breath. When you lie in bed and simply say, "Hi." You tried to ghost God, but what if he never left the conversation? What if the silence wasn't distance, but space? What if he knew you needed time, and he gave it? What if he waited, not to punish, but to welcome? You begin to see it now, not a relationship abandoned, but paused, held gently, preserved with tenderness. Like a letter, never mailed, but never thrown away. And now it's time. Not for a grand return, not for repentance wrapped in performance, just honesty, just presence. You whisper again, this time with more certainty. I'm here. And in the stillness that follows you, feel something settle, not an answer, not a sign, just the quiet sense that you were heard. Maybe ghosting God was never the end. Maybe it was the pause before a deeper beginning. You think about how often you've wished someone would reach out first. How often you've stared at your screen, waiting for a text, a call, a notification that says, "You matter." And now, in the quiet, you wonder if that's exactly what God's been doing all along. Not through digital alerts, but through longing. Through the ache, through the unshakable feeling that something more is still possible. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to know that even when you walked away, love never did. To believe that the silence you feared might have always been filled with presence. To trust that a whisper of return is met with a rush of welcome. You're not too far gone. You're not too late. You're not ghosted back. You are seen. You are known. And even in the quiet, you are wanted. It used to be easier, didn't it? Talking to God in the dark. Whispering into the air like it was a secret language only the two of you understood. You didn't worry about theology or structure. You weren't performing. You were just a soul tired or joyful or confused, and you told him so. You missed that version of yourself. The one who didn't need permission to pray. The one who believed the night was holy simply because he was near. Now most nights, you talk to screens. You vent in DMs. You draft captions. You send voice notes and delete them before they're played. And deep down, none of it feels like being heard. It feels like performing loneliness for people who are too tired to care. And yet there was a time when you used to talk to him here, in the very same dark, before the blue light, before the scroll, before your thoughts were shaped by trending sounds and disappearing stories. Back then, your soul had more room, and prayer didn't feel forced. It felt like breathing. You wonder what happened to that rhythm, the easy familiarity, the way you used to say, "Hey" to God without ceremony. Just raw, unedited communion. You didn't always know what you believed, but you knew you weren't alone. You remember one night you were younger, maybe still figuring everything out. You couldn't sleep. The world felt heavy. And so you talked. Not out loud, not formally, just with your heart. And something answered. Not in words, not even in a feeling, but in stillness that felt safe. You want that again. Not certainty, not religious fire, just Him. But life has grown noisy, and the dark has been filled with entertainment, and prayer feels like a forgotten language. You wonder if it's too late to pick it back up, if you've drifted too far into the habit of explaining everything to everyone except the one who never needed the explanation. But the ache you feel tonight, that is prayer. The reaching without words, that is communion. The stillness you keep returning to, that is presence. You think of the story Jesus told of the shepherd who leaves 99 to find one. You've heard it so many times, it's lost its edges. But tonight, it feels different because you are the one, not the obedient, not the predictable, the wandered one, the quiet one, the late night one. And maybe He's been looking for you, not to scold, but to walk with. You imagine it, a soft nudge on your shoulder in the dark. No demand, no sermon, just a whisper. You still talk to me in your sleep. That image brings you to stillness, because you didn't even know your heart still remembered how. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight. You don't need to say the perfect thing. You don't need to rekindle everything in one breath. Just speak again, just once. Even if it's only, "Are you still here?" And when no lightning strikes, when no heavens part, only peace, you'll know He never stopped listening. Even when you forgot how to speak. You've been consuming all night. Not food, not drink, just content, input, ideas, sounds, images. Streams of thought you didn't ask for, didn't seek, just arrived one after another, designed to hold your attention, but not your heart. And now, despite all of it, you're still empty, not broken, not lost, just unsatisfied. Like you've been filling yourself with everything except what you actually needed. It's a strange kind of hunger, the soul's kind. It doesn't growl. It doesn't ache like your stomach. It shows up as restlessness, as distraction, as that feeling you get after binging a show, closing the app, and realizing you still feel alone. Tonight, you face it honestly. You're spiritually full, but malnourished. You've consumed more than ever before. Content advice, opinions, self-help, but you still feel starved. Because information is not intimacy, and consumption is not communion. You think about all the inspirational things you've saved for later, the reels you bookmarked, the quotes you nodded at, the podcasts you promised to come back to, but nothing stuck. Because your soul doesn't need more noise. It needs nourishment. You remember when one verse, one whispered prayer, one moment of silence was enough to carry you through a week. You remember when awe could be found in a sunrise, in laughter, in the quiet peace of knowing you were not walking alone. And now you scroll and scroll and scroll. You've traded eternal presence for temporary distraction, and you're not mad about it. You're just done. You whisper it in the dark, "I want more than this." Not more success, not more answers, more depth, more stillness, more Him. You wonder if God still meets people in the middle of their scrolling, if grace can interrupt algorithms, if the Spirit ever shows up between reels. And maybe He does. Maybe that's what this is. Not an accident, not another video, but an interruption, a sacred one. You think of the story of Jesus in the wilderness. No screens, no voices, no comfort, just silence, temptation, and the ache of true hunger. Not for food, but for truth, for clarity, for connection. And there, in the absence of everything, He found something greater. You wonder if this moment, this ache you feel, is a kind of wilderness, a space where the usual can't satisfy, and the divine becomes visible. Maybe your hunger is holy. Maybe your emptiness is evidence that your soul remembers what it was made for. Not endless scroll, not perfect content, but communion. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to close the apps just for now, to stop searching for the next hit of meaning, to believe that silence can feed you better than noise. You're not weak because you're tired. You're not broken because you feel numb. You're just a soul that's starving for something real. And the one who called Himself bread, He's still here. He's not behind the next link. He's not on a trending page. He's in the quiet. And tonight, so are you. You once heard someone say that grace is like Wi-Fi, always present, but only accessed when you connect. It made you smile. It felt modern clever. But tonight, it doesn't feel like a metaphor. It feels real. Because tonight, connection means more than signal bars. You've spent hours online, connected to everything and everyone. But your heart, it's been offline, unplugged, unreachable. You've felt the difference even if you didn't have words for it. And now, in this still moment, you begin to wonder, what if grace does have Wi-Fi? What if divine love is always broadcasting quietly, steadily, just waiting for you to log in, not with effort, not with credentials, just with presence? You pause, no passwords, no requirements, just this moment, this breath, this awareness, and suddenly you feel it. Not emotion, not sensation, just connection. A sense that you're not alone, that someone has been waiting on the other side of your silence, not impatiently, but tenderly. You realize now this has never been about your performance. God doesn't need a perfect connection. He just needs you to stop refreshing long enough to receive. You remember the woman in the crowd reaching out just to touch the edge of Jesus's robe. She didn't make a scene. She didn't explain herself. She just reached, and that was enough. You wonder how often your soul has been doing the same, reaching in small, quiet ways. Every time you sighed at your screen, every time you looked up instead of down, every time you whispered, "I miss you," even when you weren't sure who you were talking to. That was connection. That was grace. It didn't require perfect words, just desire. You look at your life now, your habits, your rhythms, your relationship with your phone, your people, your own reflection, and you realize something. You've become an expert at connection, but not always the kind that heals. You answer every message, react to every post. But when was the last time you sat with God, not to get something, not to fix something, but just to be? Tonight, maybe this is your reconnection, a return to presence, a quiet logging back in. No performance, no password, just permission. To believe you are still welcome. To believe grace doesn't buffer. To believe he hasn't gone anywhere. You close your eyes and smile even just a little, because this stillness, it's not empty. It's full of something soft, familiar, holy. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to stop striving, to stop proving, to simply breathe and say, I'm here. And in return, to feel without sound, without thunder, something reply. I've been here all along. It's late. You're tired. But your mind won't quit. You lie still, but your thoughts still pace. Quietly, relentlessly. That familiar loop. What am I doing with my life? What does any of this mean? Why do I feel so hollow? So you reach for your phone again, not because you need information, but because you need comfort. You type a question into the search bar, not out loud, but in your soul. What do I do when I don't feel anything anymore? The search engine doesn't blink. It gives you results. Lists, videos, advice. You scroll, skim click, backtrack. None of it answers the ache, because none of it truly knows you. And then it hits you. The one you actually wanted to ask was God, but instead, you asked the algorithm. You're not ashamed of that. You're used to it. It's what you do now. You search when you're lost. You Google when you're scared. You look for something, anything, that might understand. But nothing understands the way he does. You want to believe he still listens. That even now, after all the times you've substituted prayer with search engines, he still waits. That the questions you've been afraid to ask him, he's already seen them. You remember something: God doesn't need you to type your prayers. He hears the ones you whisper through clenched teeth, the ones buried beneath distractions, the ones tangled in silence. There's a story of a father who brought his child to Jesus for healing. The man believed, sort of. He said, I do believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus didn't correct him. He helped him. That story suddenly feels like yours, because tonight your prayer isn't polished. It's fragmented. It's doubt and hope braided together. It's a search bar full of questions you're too tired to finish. But maybe that's the realest prayer you've ever prayed. You wonder if God reads every unsent message, if he scrolls your heart's history and sees the questions behind the questions, not to track you, but to love you. Maybe your doubt isn't a sign of failure. Maybe it's a sign of life, of longing, of a soul still reaching for something bigger than likes and views. You realize now there's a sacred difference between searching and seeking. Searching is reactive. Seeking is relational. You haven't just been looking for answers, you've been seeking presence. And tonight, you found it. Not because the questions disappeared, but because someone was finally listening. Not the algorithm, not the audience. God, the one who doesn't rank your words, who doesn't need you to phrase it right, who doesn't demand your certainty, just your heart. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to stop asking the internet for what only heaven can offer, to let the search end not with clarity, but with comfort, to remember that the God who made your mind already knows your questions, and he's not overwhelmed, he's not disappointed, he's just near enough to hear even the things you don't say. You've written prayers before, maybe not on paper, maybe not in a journal, but you've drafted them in your head, in your notes app, in the silence between waking and rising. Sentences you never spoke. Words that trembled in your throat but never found a way out. You told yourself it wasn't the right time. You told yourself he already knew. You told yourself you'd say it when you were more something, put together, sincere, clean. But now those drafts remain, scattered through the corners of your memory like unsent letters, some of them raw, some of them quiet, some just a single word, help. And tonight you wonder, what if God read them anyway? Not after they were finished, but in the moment they formed, mid-sentence, mid-sigh, mid-tear. What if God doesn't need punctuation to understand the shape of your soul? You sit with that because you've always assumed prayer had to be spoken, had to be neat, had to be offered with intention. But what if your very existence was already a kind of dialogue? What if your breath has been saying, stay this whole time? You remember moments, lying on the floor, staring at the ceiling, unable to speak, but desperate to be heard. Closing your eyes in the middle of chaos, just to say nothing, but feel something. Drafting a message to God, like a letter to someone you weren't sure was still checking in. You wonder if God has a folder for those. The ones you didn't send. The ones you couldn't finish. The ones you thought didn't count. Because grace doesn't only gather your declarations, it collects your fragments. There's a story Jesus once told about a father who had two sons. One left, the other stayed. But neither really knew how to speak to the father. One rehearsed his return. The other withheld his love. And the father, he came running, not because of perfect words, but because of proximity. That's what you feel tonight. Not eloquence, just nearness. You're not performing, you're not producing, you're just here. And that's enough. You begin to realize all this time, God has been in your draft folder, not editing, not waiting for polish, just present, just watching you piece it together, holding the space while you learned to find your voice again. He saw the sentences you didn't finish. He heard the thoughts you whispered and erased. He never needed the full paragraph to love you. Maybe you've spent more time with him than you thought, not in church, not in formal prayer, but in the pause, in the scroll, in the way your heart always reached, even when your hands didn't fold. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight. You don't need to send anything. You don't need to start over. You just need to know nothing was missed. No prayer too quiet, no thought too incomplete, no draft too rough. You were heard, and that is all that ever mattered. It's funny how loud the world is about things that don't matter, and how quiet your soul becomes about the things that do. You get notifications all day, likes, comments, ads, updates, each one telling you what to want, what to fear, what to chase. They feel urgent, but they never feel sacred. And then there's this feeling inside you, this strange longing that has no push notification, this hunger that no headline can satisfy. You can't explain it, but it shows up in quiet moments, in between tasks, after the scroll ends, when the noise dies down and something inside you leans forward, waiting. Waiting for what? You're not sure. Maybe for someone to notice you stopped pretending. Maybe for something real to pierce through the fog of curated lives. Maybe for a whisper that says, I see you. You never got a notification for that. But somehow, your heart keeps checking. You wonder if this is what it means to be human, In an age of algorithms flooded with information, but starved for intimacy, you're more connected than ever and lonelier than you've ever dared to admit. You look at your feed and everyone's doing something, becoming someone, teaching, selling, preaching, achieving, and you're just here, tired, questioning, wondering why the things that once filled you now feel flat. You swipe past another ad for mindfulness, another post about productivity, another quote about self-love. They're not bad, but they're not enough, because what you crave isn't more input, it's interruption, a sacred one. You begin to realize maybe that longing you feel, the quiet, unnamed ache, is holy. Maybe it's God's way of reaching you, not with thunder, but with stillness, the way he reached Elijah, the way he met people not in temples, but in dinners, in crowds, in silent moments, beside wells and fig trees. Maybe that longing is his way of saying, you were made for more than noise. And maybe grace doesn't come with an alert. Maybe it waits at the edges of your awareness, showing up like a quiet invitation. Come sit with me. You think about how much of your life has been defined by alerts, emails, messages, updates, each one pulling your attention elsewhere, but never inward, never upward. And now, as the night deepens, you finally feel it. A desire that doesn't refresh. A longing that doesn't expire. It's not flashy, but it's real. And it doesn't demand anything from you, only your presence. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to let yourself want something deeper, to let yourself sit in the ache without fixing it, to believe that longing is not weakness, it's evidence of life. And the one who planted that longing, he's not waiting for you to solve it. He's already sitting beside it. You've been measured your whole life. Grades, followers, steps, engagement, deadlines, likes. You learned early that value was something earned, tracked, counted. Even your emotions were categorized too much. Not enough, inappropriate, inconvenient. You became a collection of metrics. But tonight, as you sit in the quiet, stripped of performance and untouched by judgment, another truth dares to rise. What if you were never meant to be data? What if God never looked at your life in numbers, but in nearness? Not as a chart, but a child. Not as a result, but a relationship. It sounds beautiful, but hard to believe. Because when you've spent so long trying to be seen, trying to matter, trying to meet some invisible standard, it's terrifying to hear you already do. You think of all the times you tried to quantify your worth, all the achievements stacked like armor, all the metrics internalized like gospel, and still here you are, empty, not broken, just done performing. You crave a love that doesn't audit you, a presence that doesn't need credentials. And that's where God meets you, not at your peak, but in your pause. Not when you're killing it, but when you're quietly asking, am I enough if I do nothing at all? The answer doesn't thunder. It doesn't flash. It arrives as stillness, warm, unmistakable, like the weight of a hand resting on your back, not pushing, just holding. You think of the story of the lost sheep again, but not the wandering. This time, you imagine the moment the shepherd finds it, not with frustration, not with scolding, but with joy, because it was never about the 99. It was always about you, not your productivity, not your engagement rate, you. And in a world that constantly tells you to do more, be more, show more. God says, come rest, not because you've earned it, but because you are loved. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to unclench your jaw, to let your shoulders drop, to believe just for now that you are not a project. You are a person, sacred, loved, unmeasured. And even if you never post again, even if you never prove anything else to the world, you are already enough for him to stay. There's something you keep deleting. Not a post, not a photo, an app. You download it when the loneliness peaks, when the ache outweighs the logic, when you need to feel wanted even just for a few minutes. And then once the emptiness returns, once the echo sets in, you delete it. Again, it's a pattern now. Tap, download, swipe, feel, regret, delete. You've tried to convince yourself it's harmless. Just something to pass the time. Just another way to distract the ache. But deep down, you know, it's not the app you're chasing. It's what it promises. Connection, comfort, belonging. But it never delivers. Not really. Not for long. Because what your soul truly craves doesn't come in a push notification. It doesn't flirt. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't disappear after a day. It stays. And every time you delete that app, something deeper stirs in you. A quiet truth you've been trying to ignore. You miss God. Not the God of theology. Not the God of rules. The God who simply stayed. The one who didn't vanish after your last mistake. The one who didn't ghost you when you felt unworthy. The one who didn't need a curated profile to find you beautiful. You remember when prayer used to feel like presence, when you didn't have to beg to be heard, when you didn't have to prove you were lovable. You miss that. And maybe that's why you keep deleting the distraction. Because even if you don't run to him yet, you know. He's the one your heart is trying to get back to. You remember the story of the woman at the well. How she came looking for water, but left with something deeper. How she tried to change the subject to deflect her shame. And still Jesus stayed. He didn't leave when the truth came out. He leaned in. That's the kind of love you want. Not a fleeting match. Not a temporary high. But a gaze that doesn't look away when things get real. And God, he has never looked away. You think of how many times you've uninstalled faith, not in anger, but in fatigue. You needed space. You needed silence. But every time you return, he's still there. No guilt, no lectures, just open arms. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight. To stop running, to stop downloading substitutes for sacred connection. To believe that the love you long for has been waiting quietly behind the noise. Not in an app. In the space your heart keeps returning to. In the place where nothing needs to be filtered. Where being known isn't a risk, it's the point. And maybe tonight, you don't need to delete anything. Just breathe. Just be. Just let love find you again. Your heart has lag. Not the kind caused by weak Wi-Fi or slow processors, but a different kind. A spiritual buffering. You felt it, that frustrating delay between what you know in your mind and what you feel in your chest. That space where truth is stored, but not yet embraced. You read the right words. You hear the gentle affirmations. You even believe somewhere deep down that God is real, that he is good, that he loves you. But something hasn't quite clicked. It's like your soul is trying to catch up to what your brain already knows. And that delay, that dissonance, it's exhausting because no one talks about how tiring it is to want to feel close to God and not be able to. How heavy it feels to say I trust you while your heart is still holding its breath. So you perform, not for God, but for yourself. You repeat mantras. You light candles. You journal. You speak softly to yourself in the mirror. You do all the things that once worked, and still your soul doesn't move. It just lags. And that's when shame creeps in, quietly, gently, like a whisper. Maybe you're the problem. Maybe you've grown too cold. Maybe you missed your window. But you haven't. You're not frozen. You're just buffering. Because this kind of connection takes more than effort. It takes time and tenderness and the patience to let your soul thaw at its own pace. You remember Lazarus, how Jesus didn't rush to prevent his death, how he waited. And when he arrived, he didn't scold the sisters for their grief. He wept with them. And then only then, he called life back into what looked like an ending. You wonder if God is doing the same for you. Waiting, not because he doesn't care, but because he's not afraid of your delay. He's not anxious about your numbness. He doesn't need you to catch up. He's already with you in the lag. That realization settles something in your chest because you've been trying to fix the disconnect, to feel better, to manufacture a sense of nearness. But maybe God isn't asking you to feel anything. Maybe he's just asking you to stay, to sit with him in the in-between, to trust that he's here even when you can't feel him. That's faith, isn't it? Not the absence of lag, but the decision to believe love is still present within it. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to let your heart take its time, to release the pressure to perform, to know that God doesn't measure you by your speed, but by your willingness to stay close even when the connection feels delayed. And slowly, gently, your soul begins to move. Not fast, but forward. You didn't plan to feel anything tonight. You came to this moment the way you come to most things lately, half present, half protected. You expected maybe a little peace, maybe some quiet, maybe nothing at all. But then, something flickered, a crack in the static, a strange softness rising through the noise, a glitch, not in your device, in your soul, the kind of glitch that makes you pause mid-scroll, that makes your breath hitch for no obvious reason, the kind that feels like the air just shifted, even though nothing visible has changed. And suddenly you're paying attention. You didn't expect beauty here, not in this place, not in this hour. But beauty found you anyway, and it didn't knock. It just entered, quiet, unannounced, like grace. You think of how many times you've overlooked beauty, how many miracles you've missed while waiting for something meaningful. You were looking for lightning, and God arrived in a whisper. You wanted a sign, and he sent you a still moment. And tonight, in this exact second, you realize maybe the glitch isn't a mistake. Maybe it's the sacred breaking through the system. You think about how Jesus often showed up in unexpected places, at wells, at dinner tables, in storms, in silence. Never where the crowd expected, but always exactly where the soul was unraveling. You've been unraveling, quietly, slowly, digitally, losing yourself in output, in tasks and timelines. But this glitch, it's not an error, it's a doorway. You feel it now, the invitation, not to be fixed, not to be better, just to be. And in that permission, something holy slips through. Not loud, not flashy, just real. You realize that even your weariness is a place God is willing to dwell, that even your cynicism doesn't scare him away, that even here, in the gaps between meaning and motion, he shows up. And you don't have to clean it up first. You don't have to finish the story before he enters it. You're allowed to pause, to glitch, to break, and still be loved. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to welcome the holy in the ordinary, to let wonder creep in through the smallest of cracks, to let God surprise you, especially here. You close your eyes, not to shut the world out, but to finally let it in. The wind against the window, the breath in your lungs, the warmth behind your ribs, and something deeper, the sacred, the stillness, the glitch. That was never random at all. You chased it harder, faster, better. You chased clarity. You chased control. You chased connection. You thought if you upgraded your systems, if you refined your habits, if you optimized your emotions, maybe then you'd feel whole again. Maybe then God would feel close. Maybe then silence wouldn't sting so much. But here's what you didn't expect. While you were chasing upgrades, God stayed exactly where you left him. Not because he couldn't keep up, but because he never needed to move to prove his love. That thought lands differently tonight. It doesn't shame you. It frees you. Because all this time, you believed growth meant movement. That evolving meant always reaching higher. That faith meant running towards something new. But what if healing is about returning? What if the wholeness you crave isn't forward, but deep? You remember how often you've outpaced your own heart, pushed past fatigue, ignored the ache, upgraded your systems while your soul begged for slowness. And now you see it. The God you thought had drifted was simply waiting in the stillness you kept rushing past. You remember the parable of the father on the porch, how he didn't go chasing the sun into the far country, how he waited, day after day, eyes on the horizon, not idle, not indifferent, just present. You've spent months, maybe years, treating God like a project, something to schedule, something to study, something to get better at. And all he's wanted is you, not your momentum, not your discipline, just your return. You realize now your deepest transformation won't come from mastering yourself. It'll come from being mastered by love, the kind that doesn't rush, the kind that doesn't compare, the kind that remembers where you dropped your joy and waits there. You've tried so hard to level up, to evolve, to make your life feel holy. But holiness was never hiding behind perfection. It was waiting in the moment you slowed down long enough to be held. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to stop chasing the next thing, to stop proving you're worthy of presence, to finally believe that returning is not failure, it's faith. And the one who waited, he's not tired of you. He's not disappointed in your delay. He's just glad you're here. You carry it quietly, this guilt that no one talks about. Not the kind from failure, the kind from forgetting to reply, forgetting to pray, forgetting that you're already forgiven. You didn't mean to. Life just layered itself on top of your soul until the weight of it muted your memory. And now, when you finally reach for God, again, something inside you hesitates. Not because you doubt his love, but because you doubt your right to receive it. You think, have I waited too long? Have I grown too distant? Will he be cold when I finally return? But here's the truth. God doesn't operate like your feed. He doesn't hold a grudge. He doesn't log your inactivity. He's not an algorithm. He's a father. You remember how Jesus responded to shame, not with lectures, but with closeness. He touched the untouchable, sat with the avoided, defended the accused. Not to ignore their stories, but to rewrite them. You imagine him now looking at you, not with disappointment, but with tenderness. Not, "Where have you been?" but "I've missed you." That sentence undoes something in you, because for so long you've believed that forgiveness had to be earned, that healing had to be proven, that return required explanation. But what if the door was never locked? What if the only thing required was your willingness to walk through it? You've tried to fix yourself before coming back. You've rehearsed apologies. You've avoided the quiet because it reminded you of what you hadn't said yet. But tonight, grace cuts through that noise. Not with lightning, with a whisper. You don't need to explain your absence. Just come home. You remember the story of Peter, how he denied Jesus, how he wept, how he thought the story was over, but it wasn't. Jesus came back for him, made him breakfast on a beach, asked him not to confess, but to love again. You feel like Peter now, ashamed, unsure, still welcomed. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to stop scripting your return, to stop overthinking the invitation, to realize that redemption isn't earned, it's received. You are not a failure. You are not forgotten. You are the one he sees across the waves and walks toward anyway. It happens quietly, like most sacred things do. You don't feel a shift. You don't hear a voice. But somewhere inside, something leans forward. A part of you thought was long gone, tired, distant, disinterested, lifts its head. Because tonight, you chose something different. You didn't chase escape. You didn't numb out. You stayed. You listened. You let the silence linger. And that in itself is holy. You've lived most of your life reacting to pressure, to noise, to need. You've built a rhythm of doing, proving, performing until the idea of simply being feels foreign, unproductive, uncomfortable. But tonight, something changes. Not because you achieved peace, but because you didn't run from the pause. You realize that some of the most sacred shifts don't come with clarity. They come with stillness, a decision, a breath, a moment. And suddenly, God feels closer, not because he moved, but because you stopped. You stopped trying to fix the moment. You stopped trying to understand the ache. You just let it be there, and in doing so, made room for presence. You think of the night Jesus sat in the garden, not teaching, not healing, not performing, just being, just breaking. And still, he was held by the darkness, by the silence, by a Father who never left, even when heaven felt far. That's the kind of nearness you crave. Not always joyful, not always loud, just faithful. You wonder how many times God has sat with you like that, without answers, without signs, just faithful presence in your weariness. Not because he needed to say anything, but because he knew you needed not to be alone. You've been looking for breakthrough, but maybe tonight, breakthrough looks like not running away. Maybe this moment, this quiet click toward grace, this pause in your normal cycle, that's the pivot. Not a grand gesture, not a transformation, just one quiet turn back. And that's enough. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to stop demanding arrival, to start honoring return, to trust that the smallest step toward love is met with the deepest welcome. He doesn't ask you to climb. He only asks you to open the door. And tonight, you did. There's a habit you have opening too many tabs on your phone, in your mind, in your heart. Little spaces left running. Questions you didn't finish. Feelings you didn't process. Prayers you never closed. You move from one thing to the next, always multitasking, always slightly distracted. You wonder why rest never really feels restful. Why, even in quiet moments, something inside you hums anxious, incomplete. But tonight, something in you pauses long enough to notice. God has been running in the background all along, not demanding attention, not forcing presence, just waiting, like an open app never shut down, always ready, always near. You begin to think about the difference between what's urgent and what's important. Urgent things shout, important things wait. And God, He's never been in competition with your distractions. He doesn't shout over the noise. He simply remains available, faithful, unshaken. That truth undoes you a little because you've let other things take center stage. Work, fear, achievement, appearance. And even though you didn't say it out loud, you lived like God was a background process, important but silent, valuable but muted. Still, He stayed. He watched as you gave yourself to everything that asked loudly but loved shallowly. He stayed when you ran after things that promised clarity but delivered exhaustion. He stayed when you told yourself you'd come back later soon when things slowed down. And when they didn't, He didn't move. You think of Mary sitting at Jesus' feet while Martha ran herself ragged in the next room. One was busy, one was still, but both were loved. And tonight, you are both tired from the noise, longing for the stillness, and finally ready to choose the better portion. Not productivity, presence. You don't need to shut everything down. You don't need to fix every tab you left open. You just need to bring your focus back to the one who never left the screen, who never stopped running in the background, who never grew tired of being last in line for your attention. He isn't angry. He's just glad you noticed. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to close your eyes without closing your heart, to let God back into the center, not with effort, but with attention. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that peace wasn't hiding. It was just waiting to be seen. You lie here now, and the question finally rises to the surface, unfiltered, tender, aching in its simplicity. What if God misses you too? Not as a poetic thought, not as theology, but as real, as present, as steady as breath. What if the distance you feel isn't just yours? What if heaven aches too? You think about longing, how deeply you've carried it, how often it's shown up as distraction, craving, restlessness, how many names you've given it just to avoid naming the truth. You miss being loved without earning it. You miss being known before you speak. You miss being wanted even when you're distant. You miss God. And now, this holy thought presses in closer. What if He misses you, not for what you could be, but simply for who you are? Not because you stopped praying, not because you failed to show up, but because He made you to walk with Him, and your absence leaves a quiet in His heart too. You think of the garden story, not the shame, but the sound. The moment God walked through the cool of the day and asked, "Where are you?" Not because He didn't know, but because He longed to be close again. You never considered before that God could feel, that love could ache in return, that the Creator of the stars might miss your voice, But now you do, and everything shifts, because, if that's true, then all the silence hasn't been one-sided. Then all your distance hasn't gone unnoticed. Then maybe, just maybe, your return isn't a solo journey, it's a reunion. You imagine him watching the doorway of your soul, not pacing, not impatient, just expectant, hopeful, present, like someone who knows they'll be seen again, even if it takes time. Perhaps it is enough to simply rest in grace tonight, to let yourself be missed, to let yourself be drawn home, not by guilt, but by love. To realize that the ache in your chest is also in his. And you are not too far, not too late, not too lost. You are wanted, you are welcomed, you are worth missing. And the space between you, it's already closing. Let the world slow down now. Let the room grow softer. The breath in your chest ease into rhythm. Let your shoulders drop. Let the questions rest. You've carried them long enough. You don't need to think anymore tonight. You don't need to solve, to fix, to understand. You've already done the brave thing. You stayed. You stayed through the ache. You stayed through the silence. You stayed through the noise of your thoughts, the flicker of memory, the weight of wondering. And now, grace wraps around you, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like the hum of a fan in a still room, like the quiet flicker of candlelight, like the presence of someone who doesn't need to speak to make you feel safe. This is what it feels like to be held by something eternal, not for your strength, not for your progress, but simply because you are. Let yourself sink into that now. You are not behind. You are not a burden. You are not forgotten. There is nothing in you tonight that needs to be different for God to be near. Your doubt, your ache, your exhaustion. He welcomes all of it. So breathe. Longer now. Slower. Let the breath go all the way down. Let it remind you that you're alive. Let it remind you that you're safe. This moment isn't asking anything of you except that you be honest, that you be still, that you let love stay. You don't have to feel anything special. You don't have to make anything happen. God is here, in the quiet, in the warmth under your blanket, in the rise and fall of your breath. And this presence, this sacred stillness, it won't leave when the episode ends. It stays, even in your sleep, especially in your sleep. Because grace is not a performance you sustain. It is a truth you rest in. So if your eyes grow heavy, now let them. If your thoughts fade into softness, let them. If you dream, let it be tender. There's nothing left to hold tonight, nothing left to prove, nothing left to earn. You are home, you are held, you are His. God was here the whole time, even in the silence.